Re-releases and special editions of albums are pretty common. It's a way of reselling a favorite album while giving something new and interesting to the fans. You can have remasters, bonus tracks, or even a full remix of the original album to show a brand new side of the original. Sometimes they're a blessing, sometimes less so, but they all provide something interesting, something worthy of scrutiny. My name is Michael, and across this series we will be looking at various remixes of famous albums and how they shed new light on their source material and even improve on it, or fail to live up to its expectations. This is It's the Remix. Hello all, and welcome to the first episode of It's the Remix. This is actually something I've wanted to do for a little while. After I did that short weekly video about the remix of Monster by R.E.M., this was definitely a topic I wanted to return to. And today I am doing just that. I'm also starting off with a pretty recent remix, one that is pretty easy for me to talk about. That of course being the 20th anniversary remix of Muse's sophomore album Origin of Symmetry. But first, a little context. As stated, this was Muse's second album, released in 2001 to vast critical acclaim. For me personally, it is definitely Muse's finest hour of music. While their debut, Showbiz, is no doubt a good record, outside of a couple of theatrical flourishes, it doesn't often elevate itself above the standards of late 90s alternative rock. But on Origin, the band really found their voice by taking these theatrical hints and blowing them up to epic proportions. Mix in the dystopian themes that Muse would spend the rest of their careers returning to, and you have one of the greatest rock albums of all time. It would be perfect if not for the production. While compositionally extremely impressive, the album is occasionally hampered by its mix. It's not a terrible mix by any means. In fact, lead single Plug-in Baby sounds perfectly fine. But much of the album is very crushed, killing a lot of the dynamics on the record. This is especially noticeable on the more intricate tracks like Citizen Erased, where the crushed sound takes away a lot of the finer detail. It's also very bass heavy, which results in some tracks sounding rather muddy. It was for this reason that the remix was born. Muse brought in producer Rich Costey, who had worked with them on Absolution and Black Holes and Revelations, to remix the album. The intention was to give the album a less crushed sound, one that was more open and dynamic. This more open sound also allowed Muse and Costey to accentuate or add back in elements that were buried or muted entirely in the original mix, to add a new dimension to the album. This version was released on the 18th of June 2021, exactly 20 years after its initial release in the UK. So how does this album stand to its lofty intentions? For a lot of tracks, upon first listen, it might not sound as if much has been changed. Muse said in the press release for this album that Bliss and Plug-in Baby already had pretty strong mixes, and were therefore harder to improve on than other tracks on the record. But if you play the remixes of these songs alongside their original counterparts, the difference between the mixes is pretty notable. Take Plug-in Baby for example. While not much has been changed about in terms of instrumental balance, the track has been significantly opened up. Much of the original mix is shoved into the center of the stereo image, making for a somewhat muddled sound. This remix remedies this, opening the stereo space up to a much more pleasant scale. You'll also note that the higher frequencies have been attenuated somewhat as the original mix borders on the sibilant. The same largely goes for Bliss in terms of stereo space, providing a more open and less muddled mix, but here it's the bass that's been attenuated. As I noted earlier, the bass on the original mix often pushes towards the muddy, obscuring some of the finer detail on the tracks. Here on Bliss, the bass is reduced, allowing the song to truly come out on its own. This is largely representative of the approach to the album as a whole. Tracks across the record like Hyper Music now feature much more balanced frequency dynamic, giving the whole album a brand new edge. Now, this reduction in bass might sound like it could rob the album of some punch, but it doesn't. In fact, on Megalomania, the lower bass mix allows the organ part to really explode into the mix, giving the final track a lot more gravity. On its own, this more open, dynamic sound would have been enough to justify this remix project in my mind. Already it succeeds in bringing new light to the album, making Muse's excellent musicmanship sound brand new all over again. But it's the addition of elements that were heavily buried or muted entirely that really makes this album shine. Examples of the former are already pretty exciting. A backup vocal that was all but inaudible on the original mix of Newborn is brought up, providing the choruses with even more momentum. The strings at the beginning of Megalomania have had some effects removed from them, allowing them to build the atmosphere in full with a vocal line from Matt Bellamy that was either obscured or missing from the original mix. However, it's the additions of channels not present in the original mix that provide some of the most exciting moments on the album. A new string section plays under the third verse of Space Dementia, underscoring the fury of the first half of the track with awesome scale. A double bass is now clearly audible in Feeling Good, providing new atmosphere. But most obviously, a harpsichord line has been added back into microcuts, completely transforming the tone of the song. Whereas the original was an ominous rocker, this new mix is positively spooky in tone. It brings even more variety to an album that was already pretty ambitious with its approach to modern alt-rock, and is definitely a highlight on the project. However, the track that best defines the project's intentions and brilliant execution is the sixth track, Citizen Erased. It was this track that inspired me to begin this look at remixes in the first place and write this video, because the difference between the original and the new mix is like night and day. It's incredible. To begin with, as with all the tracks, it is now far more dynamic. This is immediately apparent the moment the guitars enter the track. Whereas on the original track they are largely buried by synthy bass, on the remix the guitar drives the track with a furious energy that immediately brings more life to the already pretty awesome track. Matt Bellamy's vocals are now clearly audible, as opposed to the original mix where they're somewhat squashed by the crushed sound. The drums ring out with an all-new clarity. Already, this is far and away a massive improvement over the original, but this track isn't finished yet. Over the outro, a new orchestra plays, replacing the phasing synths from the original mix. Now, this appears to be a bit of a contentious decision. While the new strings were largely welcomed, the total removal of the phasing synths seems to be seen as a bit of a bummer, as they led into microcuts rather nicely on the original mix. In some ways I understand this, but I think sticking the synths on top of the new string section might have pushed the mix towards the muddy, so I completely understand why they were taken out. At any new rate, the new strings are gorgeous, adding a brand new melancholia to the track's coda. Between this and the vast improvements to the sonic balance of the track, this is not only the standout of the remix project, but also responsible for Citizen Erased becoming my favorite Muse song of all time. While I quite liked it before, this remix shed new light on it enough that I finally appreciated it for the masterpiece of alt-rock that it is. Incidentally, the same goes for Futurism, which has been added to the track list between Feeling Good and Megalomania. It wasn't a track I initially cared for, but the remix on this album vastly improved my opinion of it. However, for all the praise I have just heaped on this remix, it is not a perfect one. There are a couple of decisions on this record I don't much care for, and one that I just don't think I understand. There are the smaller details. A vocal line from the coda of Citizen Erased is now missing, which I find kind of a shame. Matt's breathing in between lines of Plug-in Baby has been muted, which I think you'll only notice once it's been pointed out, but once you hear it, you can't unhear it. The chorus of Dark Shines can push towards the muddy, though to be fair, the same can be said for the original mix. And the panning effect on the outro of Microcuts has been removed entirely, and then given to the outro of Futurism. This is the choice I don't think I understand, because it does sound cool on Futurism, but I can't think of a motivation behind this change. It's just odd is all. But the worst offender is the remix of Newborn. The original mix of this track is actually pretty damn solid in my mind. A little muddy, but the aggressive wall of sound provided by the main riff and wall of cymbals made it one of my favorites on the original album. When I first listened to the remix, I was hoping to hear more or less the same, but more dynamic and open in the stereo image. However, the cymbals are turned way down and the snare is turned way up, cutting through the track to a distracting degree. I can still listen to this song fine, but it's the one track that is a vast disappointment on this remix. If I'm going to listen to Newborn in isolation, it will be on the original 2001 mix. It's also worth noting that on the first run of pressings of this album and on digital for a minute, the first note of microcuts was entirely missing. While the joke at the time was that it was a microcut on the track, it was clearly a massive oversight in the rendering of the track, and I'm left wondering how the hell that went unnoticed in the release process. I mean, sure, they fixed it, but sucks for those of us who bought it on record before it was fixed. So at the end of the day, was this remix project worth it? Unequivocally, yes. While this remix definitely has a couple of oopsies and missed marks, the good in it vastly overshadows the bad. Many said that listening to this mix was like hearing the album for the first time again, and I couldn't agree more. I know that I gained an all-new appreciation for this album through this mix. While I always was of the opinion that this was one of Muse's best works, this remix placed it firmly as the best Muse album of all time for me. Some in the Muse fandom hopes that a similar approach could be taken to more of their 2000s albums, such as Absolution. And while that seems unlikely to me, as we're like a month out from Absolution's 20th anniversary with no announcement of a remix, I would still like to imagine what that album would sound like with the massive sound that this remix has to offer. Overall, I love this remix, and given the choice between this and the original, I'll take the remix any day of the week. That's all for today, and I'll see you next time.